Hello everyone, welcome to Survive the Jive. In previous videos, I explained how 90% of the Neolithic British people who built the megalithic monuments like Stonehenge were replaced 4,500 years ago by the arrival of our ancestors, the Bell Beaker folk from Holland. They brought Indo-European languages to Britain and the metalworking technology that marked the beginning of that era, the Bronze Age. I've made several videos where I visited their ancient burial mounds and talked about how the invaders brought a more martial and patriarchal culture to the country. I even looked at one of their burial urns. But I haven't talked enough about their material culture, their pots and their jewellery and their weapons. It is debatable when the Bronze Age actually started in Britain. Generally, historians say the beaker culture arrived in the late Neolithic and the Bronze Age came shortly after, but some people maintain that the Bronze Age begins when they arrive, and I think that makes more sense. The earliest smelting of copper began in Serbia with the Wiltshire culture about 7,000 years ago, and they developed the more complicated production of bronze, an alloy of tin and copper, 6,650 years ago. 4,500 years ago, Indo-Europeans of the Corded Ware culture dominated northern and eastern Europe, while the related Bell Beaker people spread through Central and Western Europe, from Switzerland to Ireland and Spain. The earliest bronze working seems to have spread with the Beaker folk. While most of the Beaker invaders came to Britain from Holland, at least some came from Switzerland, and the Bronze Age weapons from Switzerland look very much like those from Britain. The Indo-Europeans who went north into Scandinavia seem to have temporarily lost their metalworking skills though. The Nordic Indo-Europeans of the battle axe culture went back to using stone axes, hence their name, and they fashioned these stone axes with seams down the centre so they looked like they'd been forged out of bronze, just like the bronze tools their ancestors had made in the continent. Then, by 3,700 years ago, the Nordic Bronze Age began, as Scandinavians traded their amber in exchange for tin from the British Beaker folk in Devon and Cornwall, and the copper from Beaker folk of Central Europe. These Nordic bronze weapons from Sweden look much like those from Britain and the continent. The densest concentration of Bronze Age barrows in Britain is in the area around Stonehenge in Wiltshire, and I'm going to be focusing on the contents of these barrows in this video. The Bell Beaker culture is so named due to the distinctive shape of these ritual drinking vessels found in their burials. Just like later Indo-Europeans, such as the Celts and Anglo-Saxons, they sometimes interred the dead with valuable goods, and other times they cremated them and put them in urns. The Bell Beaker urns are less ornate than their beakers, but much larger. This is the biggest one of them all. Bell Beakers like these coincided with the arrival of the Beaker folk and are often centred and buried around pre-existing Neolithic sites such as Avebury and Stonehenge. Along with this new style of pottery, they brought the first gold items to be found in Britain and the first copper items. Alongside this long neck beaker, which was found in a burial, was also buried these two boar's tusks. These were probably used as decoration on the clothes of the living individual. This pig's tooth was used as a pendant. It was actually found with this beaker, which was part of a child's burial in Bush Barrow G1. The ring is a thumb ring made of antler. The highest concentration of beaker pottery comes from Spain, so people used to think the Bell Beaker folk originated there, but now we know that's wrong. DNA evidence shows the spread of Yamnaya DNA from Eastern Europe into Western Europe in the late Neolithic, and that this spread was mediated by the Bell Beaker folk and Corded Ware peoples. The Dutch Beaker folk and the Corded Ware people had between 60 to 70% Yamnaya DNA or Yamnaya related DNA, whereas the people in Iberia today and back then have much less Yamnaya DNA because the Beaker folk who invaded there were more outnumbered by the Neolithic Iberians. Britain's Beaker culture didn't come from Spain, but from the Rhine area, where Beaker people closely related to a regional variant of the Corded Ware culture called the single grave culture were, and they're actually very closely related, the single grave people and the Rhineland Bell Beaker people. And 3/4 of all these northern Dutch Beaker folk in Britain and Holland had brachycephalic, that means wide skulls with a flat occiput, which is the back part. So they look really tough. They look like this man. This reconstruction of a British Beaker man shows they had the same skin tones and hair colours as modern Brits, but this reconstruction is of an uncharacteristically gracile man. Agriculture, which had arrived about 1,000 years earlier, increased over the course of the Bronze Age and after the arrival of the Beaker folk, and the desolate moors such as Exmoor and Dartmoor had more people living on them then during the Bronze Age than they had previously in the Neolithic or later on in the Iron Age. So that was a good time for the moors. While the barrows of the Beaker folk are still there on Exmoor and Dartmoor for everyone to see, what's not there anymore is all their many small thatched round houses which are typical of the Bronze Age dwellings. They would be found across the British Isles and Ireland and looked very much the same right into the Celtic Iron Age. We can learn a lot more about the Beaker folk from looking in their barrows rather than looking in their homes. The Normanton Down barrows at Stonehenge contain hoards of gold and weapons also. Perhaps the richest of all these barrow graves was one that is known as Wiltshire G5, or more popularly Bush Barrow, simply because there is a bush growing on it. The barrow contained a rich chieftain, who the historians of the Georgian era, the ones who excavated the barrow first, thought was the king of Stonehenge, or even its builder. But now we know this is wrong, because the man and his burial date to the Bronze Age, about 2000 BC, long after Stonehenge was constructed. This is a painting of the chieftain of Bush Barrow by Christian Sloane Hall, and I think it captures him perfectly. He would have been an impressive man, strong, decked in gold and respected by all around. This remarkable gold work simply didn't exist in Britain during the early Neolithic and before the Bell Beaker arrived. In fact, no gold working did. There was no gold, there was no bronze working, and copper. Then suddenly, with the Beaker folk, you get works of art like this. What's very interesting is that much of the gold is from Ireland, and of course the bronze is being used, and copper being made with tin from the West Country. So these incomes that the Beaker folk brought new skills in metallurgy, but used native materials. In fact, materials that were easier to find here than on the continent. Maybe it was because of the richness of the gold in Ireland and the tin in the West Country that the Beaker folk were attracted to Britain and came here 2,500 years before Christ and to replace the pre-existing population. A ceremonial mace from Bush Barrow very closely resembles the battle axe culture finds from Scandinavia. This is made not with granite but with a rare kind of fossil found in Devon, a fossilized sponge. It shows once again that the Beaker folk had trade networks across Britain as soon as they arrived. His enormous solid gold belt buckle would convey power even today, and would certainly attract attention. The chief also had 2 daggers. Now this one was originally studded with countless little gold studs, thousands of them. The gold studs are currently being analysed to determine where the dagger was actually made, or at least where the stud came from. It resembles other daggers found in Brittany, so some people think the gold might be able to be, through analysis, identified as gold from Brittany. Most of the studs actually fell out when the barrow was first excavated by the primitive Georgian archaeologists, but you can see them here. His other dagger was smaller. These bronze rivets come from a dagger handle that was 200 years older than the man buried in Bush Barrow, which shows a great concern with antiquity and conservatism among that culture. It looks very much like this Bronze Age dagger found in Yorkshire. Unlike bronze, wooden bows do not survive from the era, but we know Beaker folk were skilled archers. This leather wrist bracer was reinforced with bronze. Others have been found which use stone instead of bronze. You need to have a very steady hand when practicing mounted archery. And current evidence suggests the Beaker folk were actually the first people in Europe to master this skill. The first domesticated horses in Britain were brought here by the Beaker folk.
Horses in the British Isles became extinct at the end of the Ice Age, so they were hunted here as an animal that was a prey animal in the Ice Age. At the end of the Ice Age, there was no longer really a refugia in Britain appropriate for keeping a stock of wild horses. So as a result, they were introduced back into Britain after horses were domesticated elsewhere. They do start appearing in the Bronze Age, and it does seem highly likely that they were introduced with Bell Beaker cultures from Europe, which do in fact contain a certain amount of Yamnaya ancestry.
And a new paper by Jessica Rhine at the University of Geneva looks at the bones of Beaker folk who were buried with such wrist braces and tries to see any evidence of archery-based wear and tear to their skeletons. She concludes that there certainly were archers among the Beaker folk, and the braces, it should be added, really indicate the very high likelihood of mounted archery among these people. Not far from Stonehenge, there was a Beaker-era burial with a man who has been identified by archaeologists as some kind of priest or shaman. He wore this necklace of jangling bones, and he carried this dark stone axe, which seems to be something that the early Indo-Europeans of the Corded Ware and Beaker cultures had used in some kind of connection with what later became the god we know as Thor in Germanic religion, or Perun in Slavic religion. That is their storm god, their striking god, who carries a bludgeoning weapon, which in this time was a stone-headed axe. This stone battle axe lay on the priest's chest when he was buried, just like the stone battle axes of the battle axe culture in Scandinavia. That Stone Age technology is quite contrasts quite strongly with the fact that this man was a metal worker. Part of his shamanic or priestly role was his ability to work gold. Yet he was buried with very, very old stone axes, these flint axes. And this stone battle axe here, these were already like 1500 years old by the time he died. 1500 years old, that's like if I was buried with an Anglo-Saxon sword. You know, it's something that's very, very antique. But they're obviously associating all ancient bludgeoning weapons with the cult of this striking god, who I think is the Indo-European thunder god. And these actual stone axes were made by the people who preceded the Indo-Europeans, the old Europeans, but they've been reappropriated into a new cult. This dark one though, the stone battle axe, this was not an ancient one, this was made by them, and that's got that perforation, the hole, where the stone where a stick can go into it, which is what we see in Scandinavia with the battle axe culture, because it's called that because it's so much associated with these things, and they even bury them on their chest when they die in that culture. So this, you can see, since the northern Bell Beaker culture this man came from the Netherlands, it originates there, had a lot of DNA from the single grave culture just to its east, and that single grave culture was a variant of the Corded Ware culture. So that's where this Indo-European cultural influences come into Britain. It's via Holland, and from Holland it's eastward from Germany and Denmark. Another interesting thing, it looks like he was tattooed. We don't have any skin to show that, but there's a little needle and these cups with it, which may have contained a pigment. So maybe he was one who tattooed other people in some kind of ritual, or maybe he himself was very heavily tattooed, or who knows. But it does seem that he was part of his job, as well as working gold and leading this axe-related cult, was to tattoo the skin of people. These pointed bones decorated the hem of the priest's cloak. So they're all from deer and sheep. Many boar tusks, once again. This incense burner was found in Bush Barrow G8 and is called the Stonehenge cup. It could be used to burn scented tree resins in religious rituals. They probably didn't have access to frankincense, but perhaps they used some local resin in order to get nice scents to emerge in their religious rituals and to give these incense offerings, just like many later pagans did in Rome. Now, such incense burners are normally found in barrows containing female burials. This style is called a grape cup for obvious reasons. This necklace was made from 16 wolf teeth and 2 dog's teeth. Perhaps it was related to the cult of young Indo-European warrior bands who themselves lived like roving wolf packs. Did they wear this in some kind of initiation? This dark red bead is the first ever known glass object from Britain. It comes from a barrow, of course. This one was in Wiltshire, G42. Now this looks like a Christian coin, but it is in fact a golden sun disk from the Bronze Age. Solar symbols were central to the early Indo-European religions. We see clear representations of the sun in the Trondheim chariot from Denmark, where it's depicted being pulled on a wagon like the later solar chariots of many Indo-European religions, Hindu, Roman, Greek, etc. Gold is naturally associated with the sun and with solar regality by virtue of its purity and beauty, and of course the colour resembles sunlight. The Beaker folk loved gold. This bone pendant is covered in gold. This black shale cone was worn as a pendant and was covered in that gold foil, with the lid incised with what looks like a cross. G8 Wiltshire Barrow also contained a shale black pendant with a gold cover. There's something associated with women, it seems, but that was also a woman's burial. This halberd pendant reminds me very much of much later Thor's hammer pendants. It's a striking weapon, a replica of a striking weapon worn as a pendant. This one had an amber handle wrapped in gold. The British gold most likely all comes from Cornwall. These are actually from Irish Bell Beaker burials, and they might have been made in Ireland or in Cornwall and then imported. There's a lot of gold in Ireland, but for some reason they like to import gold from Cornwall, perhaps because it was seen as exotic and therefore more valuable than the local gold. It shows a very different attitude to currency than the one we understand. And this beautiful golden drinking vessel was made from a single sheet of gold by Beaker folk in Central Europe about 4,000 years ago. Compare them to these items from Bronze Age Sweden. All were found in a single barrow in Hårga. It was the barrow that has more gold in it than any other barrow in Scandinavia. Gold wasn't the only precious substance associated with the sun. These gold solar discs are made with amber. They came from a woman's burial, Wiltshire G8, along with these amber pendants. Amber shows up for the first time in Britain, along with gold, just as the Bell Beaker folk are arriving here. But the only place they could get amber from was the Baltic Sea region, Scandinavia for example, which shows they had extensive trade networks stretching as far north as Denmark. Amber was traded across the Indo-European world and beyond, as far as the Semitic cultures of the Levant. The ancient Egyptians and the ancient Greeks had myths associating it with the sun. Ovid wrote of the daughters of Helios, the sun god, whose tears became amber when they hit the water. Later, when Apollo absorbed Helios' role as sun god, he became associated with Hyperborea in the north, where amber actually comes from. The Lithuanians also traded amber, and they still do today. When they were pagan, they believed amber to be the tears of their sun goddess, Saula. This same Indo-European belief must have existed among the British Bell Beaker women who loved their amber jewellery so much. I assume the belief emerged as soon as Indo-Europeans came into contact with amber. The woman who wore all these impressive amber beads must have been an aristocrat. She was cremated at Upton Lavelle, and her ashes placed in a barrow, along with these amber beads, as well as these golden drum beads, this gold plaque, which was likely attached to her clothing somehow, these lovely golden ornaments, the shale cone and golden cover I showed earlier, a grape cup incense burner, some more amber beads, and a bronze dagger, perhaps ceremonial. Over the Bronze Age, metallurgy improved and the weapon hoards got larger. This hoard of bronze fallerais and spearheads was found in the River Avon in Melksham. You can see this fallerais was ritually killed with several stab marks before being deposited into the river. Other items were bent, a practice continued by Celtic and Germanic people into the Iron Age and beyond. By 1000 BC, we see depictions of human-like figures, like this horned man harness fitting from Yorkshire. Is it a god? This Iron Age socketed axe looks pretty much like the earlier ones of the Bronze Age, and this Iron Age burial urn is just like the Bronze Age ones, so there was cultural continuity into the Iron Age, even though the Celts invaded and brought a new language at some point during that time. Smithing in the Bronze Age involved the use of toxic substances like arsenic, and this meant that many of the early smiths were sickly or crippled. And that explains why later Indo-European smithing gods of the Iron Age, such as the Greek Hephaestus and the Anglo-Saxon Wayland, were actually crippled. And that means there must have been an older, crippled Bronze Age Indo-European smith god. I collaborated with two artists to make this video. Christian Sloane Hall made this utterly awesome picture of the Bush Barrow chief. Check out the link in the description to see more of his work, or take a trip to my Teespring store to buy a shirt with the chief on it, or one of the many other designs available. The very detailed and beautiful map of early Bronze Age Europe, which I helped to research, was created for me by cartographer Dan Kogasov. Look in the description to this video to check out the link to his DeviantArt page where you can see more of his work as well. If you like this kind of content, then click subscribe now, and make sure to go through some of my older videos because there's a ton to go through. I've been doing this for years. You can also access exclusive content if you become a patron on either Subscribestar or Patreon. Links to both in the description. Finally, before I go, a word to my loyal subscribers. Make sure to head over to bitchute.com and subscribe to me there too, because YouTube are becoming less and less reliable and I need to have a contingency plan in place should anything happen to this channel in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.